We always start off with this slide talking about the worldview. Today we're going to talk about the worldview from humanism and economics. If you look at it on the surface, humanism from an economic perspective espouses a lot of some of the same things that we espouse from a Christian viewpoint. Most humanists, for instance, and we're going to talk about definitions here shortly, but most humanists, for instance, are socialist. Socialist would, their view is that we need to share the wealth. We need to spread it out. We need to help the poor. Those are all good things. We're all on board with that. The problem you start to run into then is the motivations and the commands versus cheerful giving, things along those lines. But we're going to talk about economics from a biblical viewpoint today. Oh, and by the way, there will be a quiz. Let's talk about some really basic definitions real quick. You're going to hear a number of things. Capitalism and socialism are two of the things that you'll hear a lot. Capitalism is defined, you can actually differentiate between the two by terms of ownership. Capitalism ownership is private. Individuals. They own the capital goods. They take the risk. They make the decisions. They make the investments. It's private. You individually. Socialism, on the other hand, is centrally controlled. Government controlled typically. And so it's more of a collective opportunity. We're going to talk a little bit about free market, but here's the quiz. Think for a little bit. This ought to get you warmed up. Think for a little bit through the Bible and name a number of capitalists in the Bible. Think about it. I'll start you off. I'll start with a really obscure one, so then you can work from there, okay? Acts 19, Demetrius the silversmith. He was a capitalist. Yes, ma'am. Aquila and Priscilla the tent makers. Good, that's one. By the way, I laid awake last night thinking about a number of these. Let's see how many I missed. Aquila and Priscilla the tent makers. And by default then, who else? Paul. He was also a tent maker, also a capitalist. Tim? Joseph, probably Jesus. Joseph was a carpenter, right? He controlled the capital investment, the labor. Absolutely. And Jesus, by default, probably a carpenter as well, by definition. Job. Yeah, if you look back in the patriarchal age, most of those individuals lived a really nomadic lifestyle, right? They weren't aligned with any particular central government, therefore, by default, they were capitalist. So now you're talking about Abraham. You're talking about Isaac and Jacob. Talking about Adam on up, right? Capitalist, free market economist. One of my favorite illustrations is Jacob's deal with Laban in Genesis 30, right? It's a capitalist deal. Let me make you an offer you can't refuse. Give me all the speckled and spotted that you've got. I'll take all of those. That's a pretty good deal. Who else? Simon the sorcerer. Ah, there you go. Yeah, here's another let's make a deal. The Monty Hall of Acts. Yeah, I see that you guys have all those spiritual gifts. Let me have some. Here, I'll pay you for them. The individuals that made the golden calf. There you go. All right. The higher talent people. Now, don't get too deep into my lesson. We're going to talk about them in a minute. That's right, they did. And they were fishermen. That's right. That was one that I came up with last night. They own their own boats. So an excellent example of capitalism. There, that's right. Now you're getting into my lesson too. So you see throughout, and basically an economy that's 90% agricultural. And as we talked about, particularly through a good part of the Old Testament, you're not going to have any kind of alignment with the centralized government. By default, you become a capitalist. You become a free market economist. I have to, by the way, get the free market economy discussion in there because I graduated from Harding. And at Harding, if you went through the business school, you did not get through the years at Harding without a discussion of Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was the 70s economist, free market economist, staunch free market economist, very brilliant man. But so as a Harding graduate, I'm a free market economist. I'm not sure that I can explain what that means, except that I believe that investment ought to be with the individual instead of with the government. All right, now let's turn it around. We've named a number of capitalists throughout the Bible. Now let's name some socialists. Come on. Oh, I'm talking in the Bible. In the Bible. Do we have any socialists in the Bible?
There's something in Acts where they talk about everybody gave their money and everybody had everything in common. That's the closest thing I can make.
That's probably the closest thing that you will find in the Bible to socialism. And is that a way of life, or is that a temporary situation? That's a temporary situation. Probably about the closest you'll find. Even through some of the major projects, you get into, for instance, Solomon building the temple. Government project, but it's a capitalist situation in that he's paying people to do that and to bring in the goods and services. That is a bit of a stretch, but okay. All right, I can go with that. But if you think about it, the entire Israelite nation was given land, right? So, yes.
What about when Joseph was leading Egypt into a famine and had stored up all the food, and apparently more people than just his family came to receive food. Now, maybe there was a cost associated with it, but there's costs associated with socialism.
That's true. That's a good example. I hadn't thought about that one. Quite honestly, that's the one thing. I could not think of a situation of socialism in the Bible, but that comes probably about as close as any of them, where Joseph stored up the food in Egypt. Pharaoh? You know, I thought about Pharaoh in particular with the forced labor of the Israelites and the building of the cities and things along those lines. I'm not sure that that qualifies as socialism, because socialism is for the common good of all. In this situation, it was slavery. It was not. It was for the common good of Pharaoh. So again, another government project. Barnabas is a socialist. I think you mean when he sold his land and gave the money to the... I want to be very careful here. I want to make sure we separate socialism and charity, or socialism and benevolence. There's a difference. Socialism is government controlled. Benevolence is individually controlled. Okay, so I know where you're going with that, but it's a different scenario, not socialism. Yes, sir?
I just wanted to comment on Acts 2, with that being some sort of an idea of socialism there. A lot of people don't understand that people came from all over the place for Pentecost.
Right.
And then they were converted, and they wanted to stay.
Right.
They ran out of money. What did the church do? They gave. I don't think we need to look at that and say, oh, look, there's an idea where we can have socialism as an example of how we need to run. That was a specific temporary situation to help people who were trying to learn about Jesus, to build up the church so they could go back home and teach more people. And it was just about helping them stay and live and eat a little bit longer.
That's exactly right. If for some reason we all came together, if we decided this morning that we were not going to leave here for the next 2 weeks until we knew all that we wanted to know about economics. Are you volunteering?
If you're going to say economics, you're not talking about the present. You're talking about a projection on something.
There you go.
It's not present. You're making a projection.
Yeah. So if we decided we were going to stay for the next 2 weeks, to follow on your example, how many of you came prepared to stay for 2 weeks? No. So we'd have to go out and buy food. We'd run down to Publix and get a nice cold cut tray or something, maybe some fried chicken. But we'd have to get something for the next 2 weeks. And that's the situation that's in Acts. They all showed up at Pentecost assuming that they were going to be going back home, and they stayed until the persecution to be prepared to share the word. Do what? That's right. They came to celebrate Judaism and left as Christians. All right, so now you kind of get an idea from a biblical perspective what the examples are we have in the Bible. We have no examples of socialism. In fact, socialism is a relatively new concept. Free market capitalism has been around for a long time. I like to think of it in terms of, what's a really good example of a free market? If you go to a farmer's market and they have all the stuff out there, and this vendor has green beans, and I don't know what green beans are, they're $1 a pound, and this vendor has green beans for 50 cents a pound, and they're both the same quality, who are you going to buy from? 50 cents a pound, right? So it's competition. Who are you going to buy from? I think one of the best examples in the modern day is eBay. You guys do anything on eBay? I've never done anything on eBay. PJ is an eBay expert. But it's a free market economy, and it's self-driving. You go out there, you sell something on eBay, you send it to the individual. They pay postage, generally. You negotiate sometimes. If the quality is not good, they post bad things about you on eBay. So you're not likely to get other buyers. That's about as pure a definition of free market economy as you're going to get. All right. Everybody well versed in economics now? Oh, I didn't want to get another word. I did not put Reaganomics up there. By the way, if you've heard the term Reaganomics, it's free market. Reagan was a huge free market economist. You've heard supply side economics. A lot of that's driven by free market economy. I'm not going to get into the political aspects of what happened with Reagan's presidency, although we enjoyed the greatest period of growth ever in the United States. All right, what do the humanists say? Well, I went back and pulled up all three of the humanist manifestos over the last several years. 1933, the very first one. Let's look at some of this. Firmly convinced that existing, acquisitive, and profit-motivated society. What are they talking about? Capitalism. They're basically saying capitalism doesn't work. It doesn't work for everybody. Because remember, from a humanist perspective, we've got to find something that works for everybody. There's a couple of words in here that you could, if you look down about midway, a socialized and cooperative economic order. In the words of Star Trek, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. That's the humanist definition. Humanists demand a shared life in a shared world. As I mentioned earlier, humanists tend to be socialist. In 1973, if you fast forward again, a couple of tenets in the Humanist Manifesto too. Look down at the bottom, the very last sentence down there that I have underlined. Extreme disproportions of wealth, income, and economic growth should be reduced on a worldwide basis. How many of you in the last 10 years have heard the term wealth redistribution? Heard that a lot, didn't we? In association with government. Wealth redistribution. Did you wonder where that came from? If you're an ardent capitalist and free market economist like myself, did I mention I graduated from Harding? If you're a free market economist like myself, those kinds of things just really, it's like fingernails on a chalkboard. You would have never thought 40 years ago about something called wealth redistribution. And now it's a watchword. Now it's something that politicians run on. Wealth redistribution. You run into the same thing in the Human Manifesto of 2003, Humanist Manifesto of 2003. We seek to minimize the inequities of circumstance and ability, and we support a just distribution of wealth. A just distribution. Well, how do you distribute that? It's a good question. According to who? Well, it would be in this case, it'd be according to the government, right? That's right. That's right, a just distribution. Karl Marx advocated that it be distributed based on need. Well, what happens then? Everybody needs, right? We all need. All of a sudden, if the distribution of wealth is based on need, then everybody becomes needy. It's human nature.
Who makes that decision?
Well, in this case, the government would make that decision. Yes, Joe?
It's not the government that makes that decision. It's the person who's preaching it, because what they're saying, all of you all except me.
Yeah.
I mean, really, you think...
No, that's right.
It's not the government. It's whoever's saying it, because you've not saw a single one of these people that preach it that's ever wrote the check and give their wealth away. And most of them are high millionaires to billionaires. That you hear the most of. I know you hear it through people, but you hear it a lot from that. You never saw one of them write that check yet.
Yep. We'll talk a little bit about that later on. I have an example for you guys. Yes, ma'am.
It would never be equal, though, no matter what you did, because if you gave $10 to every single person, somebody's smarter, somebody's prettier, somebody can sing, they would just lose it, and then you'd have to do it over again.
And then you have those people that would just, that they can't keep up with money for anything.
Well, even if you considered, let's pretend everybody did their part and they did their best, it would never happen, but it was still necessary.
And that's and that's one of the reasons socialism fails in the countries that it's in. It tends to be a failure because, to your point, it's almost impossible to redistribute it equitably.
This economic study that we're going through goes hand in hand with the political study as well.
It does.
It all ties together, but it's really not about caring for people. It's about
That's correct.
right, and that's the bottom.
That's exactly
You can't
correct.
control people this way than the other way.
That's right. It's about control of wealth. You know, distribution is one thing. What the humanist would tell you is that, you know, we need to close the gap between the upper class and the lower class and basically make us all middle class, I guess. And that's, you know, that's a very lofty goal. You know, I wouldn't mind having some of the wealth that some of the people enjoy. That would be great. But, you know, that takes away certain incentives for me. Yes, sir.
You know, this is a problem that I have with some of the things like this. Like, I talk to people at work, and one of the things that they always point up is, hey, you know, the government should take care of this, the government should take care of that. In general, you know, the sentiment expressed by, you know, the Republican underline, that's not incompatible with Christianity.
Exactly.
I mean, we were told, you know, Jesus says, you know, it's really difficult for a rich man to get to heaven.
Uh-huh.
You know, and we're to be generous with our wealth. The problem that I see with people who espouse this sort of belief is, like Joe pointed out, they don't want to take personal responsibility for helping other people. They want it to be taken care of by somebody else.
That's right. Centralized government. That's the old adage, you know, I'm from the IRS, I'm here to help. My apologies for those of you who work for the IRS.
I just want to give an example of what you said tonight. Saying that socialism is not sustainable over the long term because I grew up in the East Germany. I watched that my neighbors, they used to have a lot of land. They used to be farmers. It was not taken away from them, and it became common land. Everything was community owned, and my dad, every time we wanted to buy a sack of cement or sand or bananas, we would have to know someone. It would be under the table, we'd have to bargain. It wasn't available. It didn't work. And eventually
And that's one of the problems. It takes away the incentive to produce. Because if I get, and actually this might be a fairly decent, the parable of the farmer that hired, you know, again, it's not talking about economics, but that hired the workers early in the day and the workers later in the day, and he paid them the same amount. And that may be a fairly close, but it's the same thing. It takes away the incentive.
So the government was keeping the people down, not bringing them up. So it wasn't just about the economics. It was, we're going to completely control you and control your life.
Goes back to the control. Yep.
It takes all your choices away. It's Satan, 110%.
There you go.
It seemed like one of the big differences between the two is that capitalism doesn't view wealth as a finite amount, where socialism sees the pie as this.
There's a certain pie. Yep.
Whereas capitalism says the pie can grow depending on the people.
That's exactly right. That's a good point. Good observation for those of you who didn't hear that. So a good differentiation between the two. Socialism tends to say this is the pie and we're going to slice it up like this. Capitalism tends to think this is the pie, but oh, by the way, we can have more pie. Brett?
The most stunning word up there to me is the word ability.
Uh-huh.
You know, I'm really upset that Cam Newton is, what, 6'5", and 245, and it's not fair that he got all those physical specimens where I could be the Panthers quarterback. I mean, that's the kind of thinking that goes into it. And we have to remember, the Bible is a handbook for our lives, including economics. Mm-hmm. And are you going to talk about parable talents?
I am. There's a whole lot I'm going to talk about in the next 20 minutes.
I remember, I think it was all 15 minutes or something, from the Soviet Union
There you go. That's a pretty good discussion. All right, one more, and then I've got to move on.
It's interesting to say, we talk about people that want to redistribute, they don't want to. Jesus said in Mark 14:7, "For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them."
There you go.
And so no matter whether it's capitalism or socialism or whatever, you're always going to have poor. You can't make everyone equal. So it's going to come down to charity for each individual person.
That's right. And then it becomes, so if you're trying to do that through the government, where is our opportunity for good works? All right, I need to move on. Now, having all that discussion, the Bible does not specify any particular form of economic order over another, or economic model over another. Basically, we are to be Christians regardless of the economic model that we live in. What I do want to tell you is that the humanist would espouse a socialist model. That's not a model that we see anywhere in the Bible. And we're going to get into a number of different topics associated with that. So let's talk about a couple of things that come into play. What does the Bible say about ownership? Ownership tends to be the key thing between socialism and capitalism. Who owns it? In capitalism, it's privately owned. In socialism, centrally owned, collectively owned, right? What does the Bible say about ownership? Well, if you look in Haggai 2:8, God talking to the prophet Haggai says, "The silver is mine and the gold is mine, says the Lord of hosts." As we start talking about an economic perspective for ownership, we need to remember who ultimately owns everything. God does. God does. So this discussion is moot. We no longer have to worry about who owns. Now it goes back to what Joe and Hamp said, now it's a matter of control. Who controls it? Who controls the capital investment? Who controls the capital goods? Who controls the risk? In Leviticus 25:23, we talked a little bit about that, where when God's giving the land out amongst the nation of Israel, and he's talking about in Leviticus, this is actually a discussion of the year of Jubilee. What happened in the year of Jubilee every 50 years? Everything went back. God gave you this land, you cannot give it away. You cannot sell it. You can rent it. Essentially, you rented it out over the period of maybe the next 50 years or the next 25 years, however many were left until the year of Jubilee. Basically, you rented it. The land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine. Ownership. God owns everything. Job 1:21. Job said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Who has ultimate ownership? God does. That makes the discussion on socialism moot, because God owns everything. Thoughts that you have? Another discussion that you'll have in the economic discussion is the work or labor. Labor is a key component of any kind of economic model. We're going to talk about work. So from the very beginning, Genesis 3, immediately after the fall of man, what did God say? "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread." What does that mean? You're going to work. That's right. Adam had a job even before the fall, didn't he? That's exactly right. Now, he may not have had to sweat. May not have had to sweat. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread. You're going to work. You're going to work for what you get. Deuteronomy 8:18, and you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth. Okay, wait a minute. We just talked about ownership. Who did the ownership rest with? God. Who does the ability to work rest with? God. He's given you the power to get wealth. Without God's help, you can do anything. So right now, God controls the ownership and He controls the labor. This is my favorite one on this particular passage, 2 Thessalonians 3:10. For even when we were with you, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat. The Thessalonians were assuming that the kingdom was going to come quickly. They quit their jobs, they sold their possessions. We're retired. Here comes the kingdom. Paul needed to correct him on that.
When Paul, Silas, and Timothy were at Thessalonica, Paul told them, as apostles of Christ, we could have been a burden to you.
We didn't.
Night and day, so that we would not be a burden to you while we preach the gospel of God.
That's exactly right. And we see throughout, we mentioned Paul as a capitalist earlier. We see throughout, he made tents to supplement his income so that he can continue to preach and not be a burden throughout wherever he went. All right, so we've covered ownership and labor. Let's talk about this one. Distribution of wealth. Another thing that we talked about between socialism and capitalism, distribution of wealth. This is the one Brett referenced earlier, the parable of the minas in this particular thing. In Luke, it's called the parable of the minas. In the others, it's called the parable of the talents. But at the end of that, so he goes through that, you know, how it worked. The guy with 5 talents got 10, had 10. The guy with 3 talents got 6. The guy with 1 talent had 1 talent. And they said, okay, take that 1 talent away. And why didn't he give it to the guy with less talents? That would have got him closer to the one with 10. We would have gotten a little bit more even wealth distribution at that point, right?
Because his justification of being an idol is a representative of individuals being idle. If you're working, you're using it to the good of the Lord.
So what does he say here in Luke 19:26? Master, he has 10 minas. For I say to you that to everyone who has will be given, and from him who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him.
If you don't use it, you lose it.
That's an excellent analogy. If you don't lose it or don't use it, you lose it.
The reason that he didn't give it to the lesser talent man was because it wasn't about being fair. It wasn't their money. It still belonged to the Lord or the king or whatever it was who gave them the money. It was still his money. So he was just being a good fiduciary. He was putting it with the person who made the most gain.
That's right.
It wasn't about their
He was.
the balance between the two. It was about his.
It was not about wealth distribution. It was about who had already proven that they could handle the responsibility. That's correct. We've been given God's money, God's earth. God owns it all. He did not evenly distribute it amongst us, guys. He didn't evenly distribute around the whole world. He gave each of us talents and abilities and gifts to be able to handle and do things differently. And to that end, a distribution or redistribution of wealth makes no sense. We talked about the reference from Acts 4 regarding the Christians in Jerusalem that share all things, so I won't go into a lot of that. You know, it's like it was a temporary situation. Yes, on the surface of it, it was something of a socialist model. It was a collective ownership, but it was a temporary situation. It was really more of a benevolent ownership. Yes?
Mark, I want to point out, too, that redistribution of wealth isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's not done by force. Meaning, in the capitalist society, I get money from rich people every single day.
Yeah.
They distribute their money to me voluntarily because I sell them something.
There you go.
It works beautifully and it has throughout history. So, I mean, the best way to advocate of redistribution of wealth is go out and sell the product or service to those wealthy people that want some of their money. They have it, they're willing to give it to you.
There you go. Steve?
Yeah, to add on to that, I think what's often overlooked is that's one form of redistribution of wealth. But then our voluntary charitable giving that capitalists do more than anybody else never gets looked at, right? And it's a lot. I don't know what the numbers are, but it's a lot. So I wanted to point that out. But then also to your point, what you're talking about, what do we do? Because I think a lot of humanists and socialists look at this. What do we do with Acts 2:45, where it says, and it talks about selling, distributing, and need. And you know, how do we? That's a group of. I know it's within the Christian family, but they clearly collectively sold their stuff, distributed it out as people needed, and I can see where somebody would say, well, there you go. And I think that the separation there is that's a form of principle of giving and sharing and benevolence, but not so much, like you said, an economic system, right? Because it doesn't work.
It was and again, in the Acts 2:45 model, that's still the temporary situation in Jerusalem where you've got all of these people from around the country that came not prepared to stay. And so, you know, they didn't pack for the 2-week economic course at Gold Hill Road. So it was a temporary scenario, but you're right.
Another model with Boaz, he was a redeemer. So God put in place people with wealth to be able to take care of, family, the brothers. There's a model there that says, okay, I'm giving you wealth, now you take care of it.
There you go. And that's almost a socialist situation at a family level, because at that point in time, you're right. When it talks about, you hear this mentioned several times in the Bible, and their household. Well, their household included them, all their servants, all their relatives, everybody that they were kind of responsible for collectively. But you had one, let me point out this. So it was not pure collectivism, because the firstborn got what measure of the birthright? Double, right? So even then, it's not equal across the organization, right?
Take care of.
That's right. He took care of everybody else as necessary. Yes, Janie.
God knows my heart. Well, he also knows what I can deal with, what I can manage. If he gave me what somebody else had, I may turn my back on him because I figure I don't need him anymore. You know what I'm saying?
There you go.
As a Christian, I always feel it comes down to our heart, not so much what the government wants. We know that it's difficult for a rich man, is needle, and we know that the poor have sufferings, but it's also a command that we are not to covet.
There you
I'm
go.
not supposed to be concerned with other people's wealth. I'm just supposed to take care of my own.
We're going to get there. I've been given the 5-minute sign, guys, so I'm not quite halfway through. So about that 2-week seminar, Matthew 19:21, if you want to be perfect, What did he tell the rich young ruler? If you want to be perfect, what do you need to do? This talks about what you were talking about. Go and sell all that you have. Give to the poor. He did not say, give to the government. He said, give to the poor. Was that really an economic parable? Not really. Not really an economic parable. What was he telling the rich young ruler? Yeah, you've got your priorities screwed up. Not you, Barry, but that's what he was. That's what he was saying. You've got your priorities screwed up.
Jesus told the disciples, follow me, I'll make you fishers of men. Probably paid a lot less than fishers of fish.
They sure did. Paid a whole lot less. All right. Real quick. Oh, come on. Todd, next slide. Yay. Oh, no. Try it again. All right, well, he's working on that. I'll tell you what the next slide's about. Motivations. We've talked a lot about this and this, so I'm not going to go over. You know, one of the things that we deal with now from a socialism versus capitalism perspective is motivation. What is our motivation? There we go. So if I want to redistribute wealth or give to the poor, what is my motivation? Were we given motivations in the Bible? Matthew 5:16, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works. We've talked about the fact that if I determine to share my wealth through the government because of a taxation process or a socialization process, do men see my good works? We talked earlier about Ananias and Sapphira, about them bringing their money to the feet of the apostles. They gave money. They sold land. They gave a lot of money. Was that a problem? No. In fact, he says that's not a problem. It wasn't the problem. While it remained, was it not your own? And after it was sold, was it not your own control? It was your money. It was your money to do with as you pleased. They tried to deceive. Their point was they wanted to be seen of men, and they were not giving from the heart. And then we talk about that 2 Corinthians. So let each one of you give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or of necessity. In a socialist environment, it's a necessity. Well, it's probably begrudging too. I don't know anybody that writes that check on April 15th that's not begrudging. I'll tell you, I'm going to be. I'm going to be grumpy. 2 Corinthians 9:7, so let each one of you give as he purposes in his heart. God loves a cheerful giver. Oh, good, we got it back. Savings, do not lay up treasures for yourselves on earth. Where is our savings? Where are we putting our savings away? In heaven. In heaven. What does the Bible say about caring for the needy? You know, we talked about the distribution of wealth. In Leviticus 23:22, what was the model? What was the model in Leviticus in the Old Testament? How did they care for the needy? Gleaning. Gleaning. They didn't say, okay, I want you to harvest all of this part and take it over here and give it to them. Leave it. If they're needy, they'll come get it. That's right. They had to go get it. There was work involved. That's right. There was work involved. The story of Ruth. Yeah, the story of Ruth. Absolutely. Yep. That's right. Taking care of the widows and the orphans in their need. All right, we're going to make it through this, guys. I'm sorry, I'm running late. About excess. This is where the socialists tend to get their biggest leverage, about excess. I want to tell you a story. How many of you are familiar with Lillian Bettencourt? Who knows who Lillian Bettencourt was? No? Oh, well, then never mind. No, I'm just kidding. Lillian Bettencourt, up until about 2 months or so ago, she was the richest woman in the world. The richest woman in the world. She was the heiress to the L'Oreal fortune. Estimates put her wealth somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 to $42 billion. Billion with a B. Now, if you want to do some quick math, and I did some quick math, and I'm not sure if it's right, so you guys check me on this. If you live to be 100, and she did not, by the way, if you live to be 100, and you spend $1 million every single day of your life, how much money have you spent? $36.5 billion. Lillian Bettencourt would have had roughly $5 billion left over. By the way, she only lived to be 94. Up until about a couple of months ago, when Lillian Bettencourt passed away, how much of that money did she take with her? She left her heirs to fight about it. And she went back to the person who gave her the ability to gain that wealth and the person who owns everything. And she has to answer for what she did over those 94 years with that $42 billion. And folks, it doesn't have to be $42 billion. Whatever you make and whatever you have and whatever you do in life, you're going to be standing there next to Lillian Bettencourt, and you're going to be given the same accounting that she has to give. Barry? Guys, thank you very much for your participation today.